uphill battle.
I
It is an
apologize.
uphill, okay, an uphill battle to try to get any legislation passed because of how powerful tech lobbies are. And so we set about, trying to popularize the framework. And in a nutshell, it's really this, that the framework is one that contemplates platforms, the largest social media platforms, and other internet sites, basically all sites that children access, young people access. It really contemplates the responsibility that puts the burden on the companies to ensure that their sites are child-friendly by ensuring that the sites are set at the highest level of privacy setting by default for children. And here we define children as anyone under the age of 18, which was also significant because current federal legislation defines a child under the age of 13 and California law under the age of 16. So this is really a move forward in really trying to expand the scope of who we deem to be a young person. And ensures that companies are prevented from being able to collect data, use personal data in a number of ways that we know are occurring now, ensures that platforms have to disable the ability of young people to be able to message with strangers who are not already in their adult strangers who are not already in their friend networks, turn off the ability for autoplay and similar features, enable safe search, for example, on Google as the default browser. So really ensuring that the settings and the design of these websites are at the highest level of safety and privacy for young people. And so this is an incredible step forward. It built upon the edifice of privacy legislation that California had adopted over several years, both with its first and second pieces of privacy legislation. And it's for that reason too that, we thought Colorado eventually might become an interesting jurisdiction because of your own work and your own achievements in getting a privacy framework in place. And so this is really kind of the next step in building upon that edifice. And what we've seen both in the UK and California is yet to take effect, but what we've seen in the UK certainly is that regulation works, that there have been very concrete changes that have been made by websites in order to comply with this legislative framework. We also see that because of the way that the legislation is worded, that it kind of circumvents the kind of poison pill of getting into content moderation and taking down bad content, because we're talking about, with privacy settings and safety settings, we're talking about plugging the gaps upstream and not waiting until the bad content is online to plug the gaps kind of downstream, if that makes sense. And so in America, because speaking about content inevitably gets us into culture wars around speech and expression, this is a really important step forward in ensuring that we can talk about design and safety for young people, which is something that we saw fantastic bipartisan support for. In California, the bill passed unanimously. It had both a Republican and Democratic co-authors. And so, we're hopeful that moving forward, we can see that kind of across the aisle support for legislation that really has as its primary focus the best interests and the safety of our young people. Let me just stop there because I hear myself talking a lot, and see if you have any questions before we go further. And Nicole, please jump in with anything I miss.
Yeah, I just I'll introduce myself and then maybe do my best at putting tech jargon in the total layperson terms. It's one of the things I pride myself on being able to do well. So I joined Five Rights from the California legislature, where I worked for about 10 years, first for the Senate Judiciary Committee and then for the Privacy and Consumer Protection Committee, which was the committee where all tech bills got referred. So I worked on tech policy for a long time, and was actually the first person in the California legislature to analyze the age-appropriate design bill when it was introduced in California. And I was just completely inspired by it, which is why I ended up jumping ship and joining Five Rights. But it represents a real paradigm shift in the way we treat children online and the way we treat the internet. For those of you who are familiar with COPPA, the Children Online Privacy Protection Act, which is federal law, like Mitali said, it treats anyone over the age of 13 as an adult. And we all know that children don't magically become an adult and are not able to make great decisions, especially online, where a bunch of the mechanics and what goes on behind the scenes, is not apparent. Adults can't even make good decisions on how our private information is treated online. And so this is really important because the age-appropriate design code meets kids where they're at online. It doesn't require the companies to have actual knowledge of their age. If you remember Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, she testified really clearly about how Facebook just completely ignored the age of children, and that's how they were able to get away with such, devastating practices that really harm the mental health of children for so long. So it gets rid of the actual knowledge standard, and it says if you are an online product, service, or feature that is likely to be accessed by children, as Mitali said, defined under the age of 18, then you have to think about the risk of harm to children that might arise out of the use of your online service, product, or platform, and do your darndest to eliminate or mitigate that risk before rolling your product out to the public. And so I think of this as a classic products liability measure. We see this in real life physical products all the time, right? Like parents aren't going to buy a car seat that hasn't been safety tested. I've got 3 little boys that are constantly trying to get pocket knives and Leathermans and use power tools. And even those have safety features, right? They are likely to be used by a wide variety of audiences. And so even those have safety features and they can't be sold without things that are going to mitigate the risk of harm. And so in a nutshell, that's what the bill does. It says, if you try and identify and mitigate the risk of harm to likely child audiences, then you get the benefit of a 90-day right to cure if there is found to be something in your platform that could be harmful. So this is purely a design bill. This is asking people to design their products better. And hopefully in states, there's like accompanying legislation that can address harm that happens later, but this is all about preventing the harm in the first place.
And I think just to pick up on a really important point that Nicole made, if we think of it as a consumer protection or products liability kind of law, another really innovative feature that may seem very common sense to all of us, because it is, but unfortunately it's just not present in in any tech legislation really, is this requirement for a risk assessment for companies to, put forth risk assessments. Is it once every 2 years? Once every year? Every 2 years?
Yeah, it's before your product is made available to the public, and then it needs to be reviewed every 2 years.
And that really is, again, if you follow the tech regulatory landscape, what happens inside these companies, many tech companies, is really a black box. And so having that as a compulsory feature where companies have to share what's happening and the internal analysis, as whitewashed as it may be, of what risk assessments they've undertaken, and also how they're mitigating, that's really a really big step forward.
One of the things I also wanted to point out is that this law is completely technology neutral. It applies to any online product, service, or feature that children are likely to access, and it doesn't only apply to social media or only apply, to targeted advertising. It applies to everything, and that, for the first time in my career, was actually a big selling point. Normally when you see legislation going through, people say it's too broad, it's too broad, it's too broad. But a lot of different businesses and members of the tech community were really happy that this wasn't something that only they were subject to, that it's more tech neutral. And so I think that's a really fascinating and interesting part of the bill. It also means that we're not going to have to change the law every couple years as technology changes. It's tech neutral, and in that way, it's future proof.
I was wondering if there is any kind of risk assessment guidelines that they have to follow at all, or if it's just up to them, the different companies to say what they've done.
So there are parameters in the bill, things that they have to address in order to get the benefit of the 90-day right to cure. So in order to not incur liability, you have to be in substantial compliance with the provisions that are telling you what to do in the risk assessment. So we're hoping to encourage real compliance there, and also the entity that determines whether or not you are in compliance is the Attorney General. And so if someone if they just tried to gloss it over and didn't do a good job, I personally, if I was the Attorney General, would say you're not in substantial compliance. Like, you have to give it an honest try. So there's that. But I will also say that Five Rights has worked with IEEE, and I'm trying to remember what IEEE is. IEEE, and it's a International Technology Standards Institute. It's similar to NIST, for those of you who are familiar with NIST, to create an actual roadmap for companies as they are trying to do these impact assessments. So there is something out there that companies can look to show that they've done a good job, but it is not required by statute.
So we had a question in here from Phyllis in the chat that says, would this apply to legitimate businesses only? What about bad actors?
So there's a threshold in California. In California, the threshold of the business size comes from the definition of business in the CCPA, so the California State Data Privacy Act. And so Colorado has their own. And I believe, because I've been doing some work on some Connecticut stuff, that Colorado and Connecticut are closely aligned in their privacy acts. And so it would only apply to businesses of a certain size or over. That could be changed. But I guess it's a good time to bring up the point that another component of, I think, the recipe for success is the fact that Five Rights is really trying hard to create a global standard, so there aren't multiple standards that businesses have to comply with, right? And so keeping it as uniform as possible is really helpful. But as I was comparing California to Connecticut law, even though the threshold size of the business is a little bit different, it wasn't significant enough, I think, to detract from the universal standard. But yeah, it has to, these are probably bigger than my own personal blog.
Other questions? Okay.
I guess the other thing I would say about the bad actors part about this that, Phyllis asked about, and it didn't come up in conversation a lot, but I do know from internal conversations with different tech companies during the California negotiations that the worst possible thing that could happen to them would be a judge shutting them down. And because injunctive relief is available, that is something that could happen. It's not only fines.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? We have a hand raised from Jill Smith, please.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to know, did Stride Right go to a legislator in California, or how did this all get started?
So Five Rights is an international.
Oh, I don't know what
charity.
you're saying. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, that's fine. Maybe
What
we're
what
having-
is your company or your organization?
I'm typing it in.
Oh, great. Oh,
Yeah.
Five Rights. Oh, I was really off. Thank you.
So Five Rights is an international charity based out of the UK. And it was founded by Baroness Biban Kidron, who is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. And part of being a crossbench peer is that she is not allowed to be politically affiliated. So she is bipartisan, which is wonderful. And she's been working in this space for a while. And she and Five Rights were the driving forces behind the age-appropriate design code in the UK. But like I said, one of the goals has always been to create a universal standard. And so after it was passed in the UK and a couple of other European countries, they thought, why not go to the home of the Silicon Valley and
Mhm.
see if we can do something there? And like Mitali said, not only did we do it, but we did it with bipartisan unanimous support, which is unheard of.
Yes, good for you. Thank you.
I recognize, I feel bad that we don't have PowerPoints and pretty graphics for you all to look at. So we've cheated a little bit and put in our coalition website in the chat. It's a little out of date, but you can get a sense of how wide our coalition was, led by Five Rights, and also get a sense of some of the many media hits that we received in terms of coverage of the campaign. And then the second link that I put in there was a youth campaign. So we were really fortunate to have two very important constituencies, I think, who are affected by what the current status quo, really speak out and bring their voices, lend their voices to this campaign. One being parents who've had children, impacted in any way, which is almost all of us, by some of the excesses of unrestrained digital kind of lack of regulation. And then we also had youth. And there's a growing movement of youth who are empowered to bring their voices to talk about the technology that they want to see for themselves. And what's really, what aligns really well with how they show up and this legislation is that they're both talking about design, that the youth are really talking about the technology that they want, but from a design perspective. And that's what this legislation does.
Mitali, and everyone, I have put on the Education Task Force website some of the links that you sent earlier. So I think these might be among
great.
them. So yeah, yes. So Ray says, once this goes into effect in California, would the tech companies be likely to have different standards for different states? We have ridden California's coattails on things such as mileage standards. Would this be different?
So I think this is a really interesting question, right? Because of course tech says we don't want to have all of these different standards in different jurisdictions because it's too challenging to comply with. But there has been research done by Fairplay, and I can look up the report and send it out after this. But that research shows that the personal information of youth is so lucrative for them to be dealing in that even when jurisdictions are very, very close, they will apply different standards to the youth of different jurisdictions. I think, I've been dealing a lot with folks from England and the UK and Europe, and they always forget how big our country is. But when you look at those different countries, they are very, very close together, and you can see how a lot of them will have different the same company rolling out different systems for countries right next to each other.
Have you had a chance?
I don't know if that was exactly the question.
Have you had a chance to talk with Phil Weiser, our Attorney General, and people in his office about this yet?
We have, I think, a lot of pathways to him, but we have, Nicole, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we've actually spoken to anyone in his office yet about the concrete possibility of.
Sorry about that. That's
So I think we'd be very open to having that conversation at the right time.
other questions.
I guess a few more things that I would raise if there are no more questions, given that this is the education task force. As a parent, I am entirely frustrated with ed tech. I think, we all saw during the pandemic how you don't have a lot of choice. You have to sign up for these things in order for your children to get an education. And it is not clear to me that they are always following the appropriate rules. This bill, again, being technology neutral, hits ed tech. And I found it very, very interesting that no one from the ed tech community was really whining during the California legislative process. They knew it hit them. And I think maybe they just decided it was time to comply with the law and trying to skirt it or something. But I think that's a really important thing, because that's the technology that all of our children have to use in order to get an education right now. So I think that's super important. There was one other thing I thought of. Oh, going back to what Mitali mentioned about First Amendment considerations, and also for those of you who are familiar with Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, that is the federal law that gives immunity to social media companies to police their platforms how they see fit. I think this avoids that law entirely, because it's not about policing their platforms, it's about designing them from the get-go. So it's not about dealing with the content and telling them how they're supposed to do things after the fact. It's about telling them from the beginning that you need to anticipate that you're going to have children on your platform, and you need to make sure they're not harmed. So it's like I said, it's a real paradigm shift, and it kind of takes a different approach than anything I've ever seen as far as regulating the internet and making sure that our children are accounted, like taken into consideration. The other thing I will say, and then I will stop babbling, is that in no way is this law about parental controls. I think we all know that parents don't have time to go to every single website that their kids are accessing and activate these controls and try and make sure that the internet is a safe experience for the children. It doesn't say no parental controls, but this is about putting some of the onus on the tech companies to do what they know is right. And so it will not shut down the internet for youth. I think a lot of the opposition, as this bill was moving through the process, tried to get traction with the same old argument that this is going to keep teens off the internet. And that is absolutely not true. And that's why, when Mitali raised the Design It For Us campaign that was led by youth, it was so important to have their voices saying, no, we want these protections. We don't want our data to be mined and sold. We don't want to be profiled. We don't want these things. We want an internet that is fair and open.
And I think just to underscore that point right there, tech will often, we even saw in the course of the campaign, certain platforms coming out and saying, well, we've made changes to our platform, and we have a kind of more child-friendly experience. And the way they do that is by, giving users more choice. In other words, parents controls to set the experience for their kids. We know that that's always tech's go-to, because it obviates, as Nicole said, the onus on them to kind of set it at the setting that they know children deserve. And by talking about user choice, it's really just a way of circumventing their own responsibilities. So I think this bill really gets to the heart of that.
Phyllis had a question.
Yes, when you refer to ed tech, It brings to mind a problem that my niece has, in that she isn't allowing her child to go on YouTube and Facebook. But somehow, through the system provided by the school, she and her friends have found a way to get to YouTube, Facebook, and anything else. And of course, the parent is allowing the child to be on the computer for schoolwork. But now this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems, right? When we have different sorts of laws regulating different experiences on the internet, that it creates loopholes. I know everyone's very frustrated with ed tech because sometimes in California we have SOPIPA. I don't know if there's a similar law in California or in Colorado, but if you access it at school, then it's governed by these laws. But if the children are accessing the same account while they're at home, it's not governed by these laws. It's governed by normal consumer privacy laws. And, like we already discussed, unless you are known to be someone under 13, and there's lots of ways companies can put their heads in the sand, and then these companies don't have to do anything. And so that's another, important part of this being tech neutral. One other thing I will say, and this, sorry, it always ends up, I'm just bagging on COPPA because I don't like it very much. But one of the fundamental flaws with COPPA is that parents can consent to data practices that would be harmful to their children, which is a real problem. Like, this does not, any system that is based entirely in parental consent is flawed. Like, parents don't have the time, the energy, the education, any of this stuff to be able to make these determinations. And so under the AADC, parents would not be able to consent, and children could not consent to data practices that are harmful, which I think is a real flaw in COPPA.
Peggy has a question.
Well, maybe I just missed this. What does COPPA stand for?
Children's Online Privacy Protection Act or something like that.
Children. Okay,
By the way, the issue that I brought up was happening in California, in San Diego County.
There's actually an Amnesty, is it Amnesty or Human Rights Watch released a global report last summer about ed tech, looking at ed tech across the world during the pandemic. It's really interesting. They had, I believe, 2 or 3 test sites in the United States, one of which was California, but talking about a shared experience across the board of children being able to circumvent really profound protections.
Questions?
The other thing, just to say, I think we've alluded to it throughout, is that I think it's really important to be very upfront about the power of the tech lobby and the need for a real coalition effort to surmount the arguments, the tactics that are used by tech to defeat such innovation. And, even the AADC has not escaped scrutiny in the sense that, now we're looking at a lawsuit that's been filed. It's, from our perspective as both of us lawyers, frivolous, but it's still something to kind of battle through. And so this is something, I think, just to say that any kind of effort like this is more of a process point, I guess, really requires that kind of all hands on deck effort. And we were fortunate to have that in California. And, should this go forward at any point in Colorado, it'd be great to have the League of Women Voters supporting it. That's the kind of support it needs, along with other important constituencies.
Betty. Betty, I think you're muted.
Push to get it unmuted. Uh, What is the status of this campaign in Colorado now, and who's in charge of it?
Is that a hand up to lead it?
No, no way. Oh,
We had the privilege to talk to Kathy before. I think we have just been having conversations with folks who are interested in learning more. But I think that really is a question for, various groups and organizations in Colorado. And should there come a point at which it makes sense to move forward and you have lawmakers who are interested in introducing it, we would certainly, Five Rights and other of our organizations that support it in the coalition, be very happy to support you in a variety of ways.
I know that we've been, Betty, I know that, with Action and Advocacy, we've been discussing this and would really appreciate both of the task forces that are represented here, would really appreciate having your feedback on this and your ideas on this as well. I think we have some really strong legislators who are very child-centered and education-centered. I think who would be willing to hear more about this as well. I was on one of the legislative previews. I was listening to one of the legislative previews last week, and so many of them said they were interested in child-centered legislation. So it might be something that can move forward this way. Kathy Marr says, it seems like this bill got passed remarkably quickly in California after the concept came from the UK. Were you surprised about how fast it was adopted in California? Do you expect similar results in other states?
So, there are always lots of shenanigans that go on in politics. Oh, hi, Natalie's daughter. There were no shenanigans that went on with this. Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks introduced the AADC very early on in the process. So there was lots of public notice. There was lots of stuff. I personally, when I joined Five Rights, had dozens upon dozens of meetings negotiating language with tech companies. And, everyone who came to us, we worked with. Natalie was part of the amazing coalition where when we needed support, members didn't go out on their own and amend the bill how they saw fit. They were making sure that, folks like yourselves were calling and pressuring the members and all of this stuff. So I'm not, as someone who worked in California, surprised that it happened so quickly. I think when you do things above board and you do things in a bipartisan way, you can actually get results. Makes my heart feel so good to say this, right? It actually worked. There were no shenanigans. We did everything above board. I think other states, it can work the same way, but we do need a lot of different, types of knowledge. Like, I'm not very good at running coalitions. That's not my talent. My talent is taking all of those meetings with the tech companies and drafting all the boring language. Right. And I knew the inside of the California legislature. And so having all that different kind of knowledge, having the broad coalition that can support doing things above board and making sure that it stays bipartisan and we control the messaging, I think it can happen this quickly in other states as well.
Mm-hmm. Which other states have you approached or are you thinking about?
I should tell you this. I'm being recorded, aren't I? Okay, yeah. So we have been in conversations with the following states. The top four I'm going to mention have committed to introducing, but until something actually gets introduced, which we won't know for a few days, we can't say that it's certain. So Nevada, Maryland, New Mexico, Minnesota, and then still in conversations with Connecticut and Utah. So when we talk about bipartisan and diverse, like I'm very, very happy with this list, right? We've got East Coast, we've got West Coast, we've got Southwest, and then states, you know, from blue to purple.
Mhm. Mhm. Other questions? All right. Well, you've given us a lot to chew on here and think about. Um, and possibly act. I don't know, Andrea, I'm going to pull you in as our, as our lead for action and advocacy. Do you have any comments at this point?
I don't think I really have anything to add that differs from kind of the perspective you were sharing, Kathy, that, I think that there's interest in this concept. And I think that we do have a lot of legislators that, are supportive, really kind of talking about that child-centered legislation. I know some of the early legislation that was introduced just today kind of focuses on some child welfare issues, and education related stuff in the kind of more the mental health vein, which is different than what we're talking about here tonight. But I think that, that early focus, kind of dealing with the education realm and child well-being is just sort of indicative that I think Colorado is, a conducive environment for considering this type of thing. So I really appreciate the additional information and, the fact that we've been able to kind of dive more deeply as we're in the information gathering phase. And I think this is definitely something that would be worthwhile for our task forces to delve a little more into and look for opportunities for that discussion to cross with the LAC to figure out what we might do to move things forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just so you know, the LAC is the Legislative Action Committee, and we are the volunteer lobbyists for the League of Women Voters. So, yeah, that's who we are. Okay.
Just to say that I think we've talked mostly about the substance of the framework tonight, but certainly as and when you decide to move this forward and as process questions come up about how to actually put, the kind of coalition together that we had in California, we're here, we're available and very happy to answer questions, because we did find that there were some really important ingredients, I think, to the coalition's success. Having, having lobbyists on the ground, having, comms folks who could really keep the kind of narrative going in the local media, making sure to have a researcher who could kind of put out quick and dirty research products that could be covered in the media, having, voices of directly impacted constituencies. So these are all things that we'd be very happy to share with you, because I think we learned a ton in the process.
That's wonderful. Peggy has her hand up.
Was part of your coalition school principals and school boards?
Actually, that would have been a great addition. It was not. We did manage to get the AFT and its California affiliate on board, but we did not have specifically principals and school boards on. But I don't know if any of you saw that today, the Seattle, or actually on Friday, the Seattle School Board filed a lawsuit against 4 major social media platforms. So it does seem like there's, hopefully that's a signal of a movement for school boards to kind of become more active in this space.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be a great.
I would also think libraries would be involved also.
And Ray was asking, this is the children's hour. This is awesome. Do you think your negotiations with the tech companies would have to be renegotiated state by state?
So the the main coalition, the main group that we worked with in California was TechNet, and they are represented, I think, in all states. And this was because each of the individual businesses honestly was too chicken to have their name out there saying that they didn't want to protect children, right? So they stood behind TechNet. I find TechNet very easy to work with. And so that's great. But there are a few companies that are really upset and are putting lots of money into defeating the age appropriate design code because they don't want anyone to interfere with their ability to make money hand over fist. And so one of them is a very large online retailer that every year I say I'm not going to use, and then by January 3rd, I'm already using it. You guys know who I'm talking about. And then the other one is ESA, the Entertainment Software Association. They're pretty upset as well, and I think that's because the law includes video games. And we all know that video games are not only very addictive and can be bad for mental health, but they're also one of the main ways by which sexual predators groom youth for exploitation. And so there's no way we're exempting video games. So I think those would be the two main groups that are going to throw a fit, but that doesn't mean we're going to have to go back on any of the negotiations.
All right. Any final question? Well, Natalie and Nicole, thank you so much. It's really interesting, and it really, I think for me at least, is very exciting to be able to have these protections for our children and youth. I think it's a worthwhile, personally think it's a worthwhile effort. So thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your interest. And we're very much looking forward to the day we get a call from you all saying it's moving in Colorado.
All right. Okay.
Thanks. And please call on us with any further questions you may have.
Yeah. Yes, we will for sure. Any final comments or questions just for the task force? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. I know we saved the chat, and since this has been recorded, it'll go up on our LWVCO YouTube channel. So you can share with your own groups too as well what you've learned, and if they'd like to listen some more for this meeting, please encourage them to do so. It usually goes up within a couple of days, so you can look for it then. All right, and please.
Thank you. This was great.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Very much so.
And learned a lot.
And if anyone has a way to introduce these experts to Phil Weiser, please let them know.
Oh, yes. Yes, we will. All right. You all have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
See you next month.